I did see your screen when I shared it, but I think I had a connection issue.
Okay.
That seemed to be better again for whatever reason, I guess. That's why. Okay. Just turn it off. Here. Go. Okay.
There we go. Hello. All right, there we go. Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good too. I just had a supervision meeting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't know. How are you guys doing? Are we good with sharing screen and stuff? I know you use this a lot more than I do.
Yeah, we just tested it out, so it should work.
Beautiful. And once you start, I can make a recording.
Okay.
And with your sharing screen, I think if both me and Jessie say that, hi Jessie, never spoken to you in person. We can just make sure that you have a copy, and if you want to use it anywhere else, and then post it on the blog or something, would be great.
Okay. Yeah.
I think.
Okay. You were going to record on your end, Charles? Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that.
Okay.
I know there's like a... Were you going to do it through Gisty or through another service?
I think Jessie lets me do that.
Yeah. Okay.
So I definitely it'd be better.
No, I think we're in good shape about all that, and we checked the screen sharing, and I sorted out some stuff here earlier, so I think we'll be ready when we're here. Glad to see everybody who showed up so far.
When did you want to start?
I guess we can wait like a little bit, maybe.
Okay.
Because I know in the UK it's 4 o'clock on Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe they finish. I know people like finish work on like 4 o'clock, just round the clock. How is it for you? Which part of the States are you in?
Yeah.
Yeah. So which part of it is it like central or the west coast?
Oh, Central.
Central.
So it's in the morning.
Yeah.
So I live in Central, and I'm not in New York City, but I'm in New York State. I'm on the East Coast. We've our lab is very interesting because we have people in like many different time zones in different countries. So we're kind of used to the staggered time zone, but it's a little bit earlier for him than me. Okay.
I know. I was thinking if you were on the west coast, this would be a pain. Because
Yeah.
because I did a program with Carnegie Mellon, and all the people in California just had to wake up at like 5:30 in the morning. And for me, I have to stay up till late, but I don't mind. And I guess waking up early is a bit more of a struggle. Yeah. I guess we could. I knew loads of people who can't show up because of work and everything. So I guess we would do a recording and make it available on YouTube, or I can just send you first.
Okay.
And it'd be nice, and you have something for the future as well.
Yeah.
That would be nice. So, yeah, whenever you want to start.
Okay. I'm going to welcome everyone to the seminar, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Just wanted to check the chat. Hello, Jeremy. I saw you in the chat.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can probably interject if you'd like to, But if you want to say anything in the chat, I'll be kind of paying attention to the chat too. And I think we'll probably do, most of the questions towards the end, but you can mention them now if I think they're pertinent. I might try to chime in and address them. I'd rather talk to them then.
Okay.
If that sounds okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. Welcome everyone to the lecture. I'm Bradley Alicea. I am from the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory. We're a worldwide organization of different scholars interested in things like AI and psychology and cognitive science and developmental biology. We have a number, and open science. We have a number of different projects ongoing in the lab. And one of them is our interest in sort of both, we have a philosophical interest, but we also have this sort of agent-based or AI type of interest. And so this talk is going to bring maybe those two areas together. The talk is called Observer-Dependent Models. And on the title page here, you can see 4 different agents that you're going to see throughout the talk. And
recording is on.
This is an example of the different types of, this is a reference from Pac-Man for those of you who are too young to really know that reference, but these are we're going to see these agents again in the future. So let me present my screen. Okay, so again, I'm Bradley Alicea from the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab, and I'm going to tell you about observer-dependent models. So we're going to start with a quote from Werner Heisenberg, who's a physicist, and this is probably the most famous example of the observer that we have when people talk about in the philosophy of science, the observer. This is probably the most popular or famous idea here, is from quantum mechanics, and Werner Heisenberg says, the observer registers decisions, which produces a registration, which means a transition from the possible to the actual, is absolutely necessary and cannot be omitted. And so this is an example where you have an observer that has to evaluate, that sort of exists in multiple states, and then settles on a single quantum state that's observed by the observer, leaving all the other states aside. But the idea is that there are a lot of states in possible existence for the observer to fixate on. It's the system that decoheres into a certain state, and then the observer looking at that state, that makes the actual phenomenon. This goes back to many worlds quantum theory. This is an interpretation of quantum theory from Hugh Everett, who's on the right. And the idea here is very similar. It was worked out a bit more. The idea is that there's this universal wave function that includes all possible outcomes of a system. So this is the famous live cat, dead cat. If you look inside of a box, you don't know if the cat is dead or alive until you look inside the box, and then you see the state of the cat, and that kind of makes the decision. The idea is that makes the decision for the system, is your observation of it. And so this universal wave function includes all possible outcomes. The act of observing it makes one of these outcomes distinct. So that's from quantum theory, but we can go actually to cybernetics, particularly second-order cybernetics. And we can focus on the role of the observer in cybernetics as an agent. And so there isn't a really strong connection between the quantum physics context and the cybernetics context, except to say that they also are interested in this idea of the full scope of a system's variety, or a vast collection of states or possible states that the system can settle into. And so, it could be, in this case, we have an image of a human with a compound eye from an insect. And so, in evolution, we don't have compound eyes, but evolution, if it were unconstrained, could very much give you this kind of outcome. And of course, if we talk about feedbacks and reinforcing feedbacks and positive and negative feedbacks, we can get to these different states in different ways. But it's always the role of the observer, it seems, that really makes that happen. And so then when we talk about the observer, we should also focus in on the observer as sort of an agent with an autonomous set of decision-making mechanisms and an internal model. So this is von Uexküll's biocybernetic cycle, which is an early example of an internal model. And this actually connects to cybernetics in that every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. And so in this case, we have an internal model in the brain of the agent, and it is sort of evaluating the world. It's using sensors and effectors. It's modeling the external world as sort of this internal world. And this is another example from attention schema theory, where it's very similar, where you have this, the observer is watching the apple fall, and the observer then has to put together a model of how that's happening and why that's happening. And so you can see here that they're putting together all these different sensory inputs, all these different concepts and scenarios, and they're coming up with a world. And of course, we know from the example of sensory illusions that sort of internal model can be broken often. So this is the kind of thing we're interested in here. And we'll come back to a little bit more about the sort of the cognition of the observer in a bit. But one last point I want to make about this is that, or sort of the third thing we want to keep in mind, is this idea of observing systems and sort of observing properties at different scales of observation. So this is an example of self-similarity. So in this case, we're thinking of a persistence of pattern across scales. So at the right, I have this Barnsley fern, which is a nice fractal. And down here, I have these triangle fractals. And think about this not necessarily from the pattern formation standpoint, but from the observer standpoint. And that is that the observer is actually looking at this and distinguishing these different scales of fractals. So, if you zoom into this fern, if your point of view is really close to the surface of the fern, you might see, you'll see the same pattern, but you'll see a small portion of this fern surface. If you zoom out many scales of magnitude, you'll see the entire fern, but you'll see a similar pattern. Of course, it'll look different to you because you're seeing the entire fern. And the same thing with these triangles. If I exist at a small spatial scale, I can zoom into any one of these triangles. And I think that triangle is the only thing in the field of view, or maybe there's a small cluster of triangles. If I zoom out, I begin to see that there's more structure to this, and it's fractal structure in the sense that it has, it has a similarity at different scales, but I can see more of the whole thing. I have a better view of sort of the entire world that exists. So I wanted you to keep those in mind. And this is an example, of course, of conceptual integration between scales. If you've not seen this, this is The Powers of 10, which is a movie that was filmed probably about 50 years ago, where they went from like a very small spatial scale to a very large spatial scale. And they would zoom out to show the observer. And this isn't a fractal example. This is just an example of the world where you're starting at a very low spatial scale and you're moving up to a very high spatial scale. And you can see sort of how your perspective draws out. And you can maybe understand the scene better as you draw out in terms of your point of view. And so this is all going to be important later when I talk about what our agents are doing. So now we got to get into the world of agents. And so remember we talked just a couple slides ago about this, about sort of the brain of the observer and what it's doing with input, with sensory input. And so we can ask the question, how does a single observer acquire an object? In this case, the object is going to be this world or this globe on the right. And then the second question we can ask is, what information is contained in the world? So this observer on the left is taking in information about this world on the right. And this world starts out as a black box system. We only know it's a sphere with a heterogeneous surface. And so the observer sees this and thinks, well, this is, obviously something that's spherical, but what's going on inside or what's going on the surface, you can't be sure. But what happens with problem solving and in the idea of breaking down boxes more generally, and this comes from cybernetics, if you want to know the intellectual history of it, especially the citation by Glanville from 1982. What happens is that there's this black box that you start out with, which is an unknown system. And then as you start to understand things about the black box, or you start to evaluate it, you start to build these white boxes. And this infers the composition of the original black box. So this world now, this globe, it has features we can see from our point of view. From this observer who is naive, they're going to explore the globe and they're going to find that there's elevation and there's smooth areas and there are different colors, and they're going to find out that there's maybe an ocean or maybe some mountains where there are rough spots. Maybe if it goes up a little bit, that's the beginning of a continent, and so forth. And so it can put together those things into what they call white boxes, which are inferences from the black box. However, as a representation of the world, the observer still does not have information about, say, like plate tectonics, or why those masses of land move around over long geologic timescales, or what happens when there's a storm in the ocean, or what happens when there's sea level rise. All those things are unavailable to the observer, but they exist in the world. And so this is the process of taking that black box and making white boxes. If the observer had perfect information, mind you, if they had access to every possible state, it might be possible to get a full representation of the world. But what we're talking about is simply trying to infer from a totally naive state what these things are. And so you have the world as a representation of a system. You have the observer or the agent as a heterogeneous embodied nervous system. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, this agent has a couple of parts. So now the observer is going to be broken up into a brain, which is a circle, and this little beak, which is an attentional system. So the attentional system takes in sensus from the world, from the representation, or from the external system, and then it's going to go through the attentional system, and then there's going to be an internal representation in the brain. And so you have this external representation, which is then broken down, and the attentional mechanism might scan the world for certain features, and then this brain will build an internal model of this, and it'll guide the behavior of the observer. But then we can also say that the observer also can manipulate the world or the external representation. So they can manipulate it or resample it, so they can turn the globe, they can play with it, they can see the weight of the globe, they can find out all these pieces of information that might help it understand what's going on with the external system. And so we're observing the world as a white box or series of black boxes. We need feedback to ensure a vertical representation. So we need to know, like, we can't just take sort of the thing at face value, we need to manipulate it. And feedback provides a sense of embodiment, but the senses are still a bottleneck. So one way in which they're a bottleneck, and of course, we're kind of getting into this world of observer embodiment. So it's important that the system be, or that the observer be embodied. It's important that the observer just isn't some eye, disembodied eye that's sort of evaluating things. But that there's this embodied system with features that are heterogeneous, that have some function that's, suited to find things in the world. But these senses can also be constrained. And one example, of course, is from human vision. So we see that there's this example I'm giving you here is an example of the visual envelope in humans. So you can see that humans can see things in their environment, but sometimes they can't see, for example, a 360-degree view around their body. They can only see a certain number of degrees up or down, left or right. And so, you can turn your head, obviously, but the point I'm trying to make here is that your attentional system is thus that you can't necessarily evaluate all things going on around you at all times. You're sort of, there's a bias towards this region of space around your body, and then, even within that, the attentional system will focus in on things. And there's a, so there's an optimal zone of observation, there's a suboptimal zone of observation, and so forth. So this can all shape the internal representation. Another thing that can shape the internal representation are, visual effects, like multi-stable perception. So on the right, we see this this animated GIF of a multi-stable perception. This is a model of a sculpture, of a female sculpture that's moving back and forth, but it looks like it's rotating. So, you can see if you fix yourself, you can fix on the image, you can see that it looks in some cases like it's rotating back and forth. Sometimes it looks like it's making a full rotation in 360 degrees. And so we can do this with a number of different objects like boxes and shapes where you can see two different things if you look at it in different ways. And so this has to do with binocular rivalry, which is where you have two visual systems or two visual sort of, two eyes, but we call them visual systems, inputting to the same internal representation and then competing to see which object or which interpretation is correct. And so so what I've talked about so far is I've talked about this broad idea of observation. I've talked about maybe like the way the observer is related to the natural world or the observed world. And then I've talked about embodiment, or how embodiment can both constrain and has effects on the observation. So now we'll talk a little bit more about this happening in groups. So we talked about this in the individual. Now if we have groups or swarms of agents, what does this look like? So there's actually a collective intelligence aspect to this. So in this case, what they did in this experiment I'm going to present now is that they had these agents that had a visual sort of function built in. So if you've ever heard of the Boyd's model, which is a model of agents who sort of evaluate their local world around them. They take cues from the local world and they integrate them. Based on what their neighbors are doing, they'll pick a behavior. They'll go forward, they'll turn, they'll slow down or speed up. And if this is done in parallel across a bunch of agents, they end up forming these swarms. And so you'll see this in bird flocks, you'll see this in the fish schools, you'll see this in a lot of different organisms that do this. But it's just a bunch of agents that are operating on local information. And so, but what they did in this case was they actually, and you can simulate these in a setting in a computer where you're just giving them like, giving the agents minimal information about position and about, proximity to its neighbor and so forth. But what they did was they gave these agents a visual system, and they said that you can look forward and you can see if they're, agents in front of you or agents on the side of you, and you can control your movements that way. And so as it turns out, these movement parameters are controlled by visual cues. They actually produce a wide range of variation across different modes. And so you have all these different types of behaviors and shapes of the shapes and behaviors of the collective that occur at different parameter values for these two parameters. It's the turning parameter and the acceleration deceleration parameter. So if you change those, if you allow your agents to have a visual system, if you allow them to observe their local system, if they act collectively, they're going to exhibit a large number of behaviors in response to that. And this is a demo we did of this, where we had these agents that were sort of looking at this stimulus here in a world where the stimulus moved around or was stationary, and the agents would come into the world and they were doing this independently. They weren't communicating with each other, and they were looking at this agent and evaluating it based on some simple internal model of, whether, it be like they were repelled by it or they were attracted by it. And these are the types of patterns that you would get in the collectives. You'd get these ridges, and you'd get all these different clusters of behavior around the stimulus. And so, you see these sort of collective behaviors amongst agents based on this observation aspect. So now I'm going to move on to maybe sort of measuring potentially what's going on with these systems. So a lot of times people talk about information that you get from the perceptual world. And maybe a lot of people, when they talk about information, they default to Shannon information, which is this idea of that variety provides information. So on the right, you have a bunch of squares, and there are two different states. You have Claude Shannon in the sepia tone, and you have Claude Shannon in black and white. It's pretty simple. We see that there's a fair amount of variety here. So this array would have a certain amount of information in it. And so the information would be the ability, whether there's sepia Claude Shannon or there's black and white Claude Shannon. If every image in this array were black and white, there'd be no information in it, because you would know that what the outcome would be just by looking at one of the images. But since it's 4 to 2, there's a fair amount of information. Any one that you pick at random would, maybe be sepia, maybe be black and white. So there's a fair amount of information, at least according to the Shannon definition. But what about when we want to evaluate things in the world and their relationship to the individual and to the observer? So in this case, we're going to talk about something called Gibsonian information. And this is a thing that our group has been working on defining. And in Gibsonian information, the idea is that motion provides information. So you have things like optical flow, relative motion between objects and the observer, and structure from motion. And all those things contribute to potential measures of Gibsonian information, which differentiate it from Shannon information, but are maybe more germane to like the observer and the perceptual world and that sort of thing. So again, we go back, we revisit this idea of observer embodiment. So in this case, we have our agent, and that's on a roller coaster. And this is, this roller coaster is just kind of doing, going through a run of the roller coaster. It's turning, it's going upside down, and so forth. And so you're getting a lot of different cues as an agent riding this roller coaster. You're getting direct multisensory perception. So you're getting visual cues, proprioceptive cues, in addition to motion information about where you are, what your motion state is, how fast are you going. And this observer experience determines the richness and detail of that internal representation that we talked about earlier. So how much, if you have an internal representation of riding a roller coaster, just from looking at this picture, you might get some visual cues of, motion, but you don't have like the proprioceptive cues of being on a roller coaster, and you don't have the orientation cues of actually seeing like the sky versus the ground and so forth. But from purely emotion standpoint, we can get some information out. And again, this doesn't have to be visual, but these are going to be visual examples. So we're going to talk about things like disjoint distributions, contingent action, and coherent movement. And each of these potential measurements give us a quantitative approximation of motion information relative to stasis. I'll show you what that means in a minute. So, for example, the disjoint distribution is this thing on the left where it's Gibsonian information based on the difference between, say, these two arrays of static. So on the bottom we have a static, it's white noise, but it's static. It doesn't move. And so we can compare that to something like white noise that is moving, stochastically, so that, there's this obvious visual effect. And so we can compare these two and we can get a number. And it's a non-zero number, which means that there's motion information in this comparison. This is moving relative to this. If this had some motion in it, if this had a low amount of movement, or it was not as, didn't move as quickly as this array, then we could still extract that difference. But it would be up to the observer to detect it. But it would still be a non-zero number for this G parameter. This is in comparison to Shannon information, where you have a disjoint distribution of things, HX and HY, and the number you get is 0. So the only, in mutual information, there has to be overlap in the sets. In Gibsonian information, we're actually relying on, we can have the sets that quote unquote overlap or don't overlap, and we're getting something different, qualitatively different out of this. The second thing is contingent action, where in this case we have this movie, it's a GIF, it's just of this ball rolling downhill after these people who are running from it. And the idea here in this one image on the top, you have the movie with scenes cut out of it, and on the bottom you have the full movie. And so in this case you have contingent action. One frame precedes another frame precedes another frame. In the example up here, you have scenes cut out, so contingent action is disrupted. At the bottom, the action is more continuous, so you could go back to each frame and evaluate what happened there. The idea, though, is that when you disrupt that contingent action, you either lose information outright, or you make up what's supposed to be in between those frames. And so you can see on the right, you have this tree of contingent action. And so you can play around with this tree. You can knock nodes out. You can, replace nodes, empirical nodes with things that you make up on your own as an observer, or that you get maybe from your neighbor to fill in the gaps. And so this allows us to sort of model the flow of action, in this case the flow of motion in a scene, but it's more fundamental than that. It's more like we can model both the motion and the context in different ways using a tree like this. The third example is coherent movement, and this goes back to the collective behavior example I talked about. So in this case, we're talking actually about two different systems here. On the top here in this area, we have a bunch of balls that are of different colors and are moving randomly around this box. They're just kind of bouncing around. There's no coherent movement in that because it's all sort of a stochastic process driving those balls. But at the lower right, we have this flock, and I told you about flocks earlier, where they move in a coherent fashion. They follow their neighbor based on some criterion, and they can, form these intricate shapes and these very coherent shapes, and so we call that coherent movement. And so we do this. We can maybe make comparisons using the first example that we had of disjoint distributions, but we can also look at this in terms of individual particles in these arrays, where the previous heading is aligned with the current heading of the observer and mean current heading of the observed neighbors. So if you put this in the context of the observer, so the observer is embedded in one of these arrays, then they can actually use that information from the swarm or from the group to form these coherent movements rather than these random movements at the top. So the coherent movement is actually not so much about observing the whole one of these whole arrays, but actually being embedded in one of these arrays as an actor and actually getting information from your neighbors locally, but integrating it globally. And so this is, again, something that in fact, you could also have the observer do both at the same time. They could see an example of their coherent movement as a collective thing, but they could also take in information from their neighbors locally and integrate that. And so these are things that, if you incorporate these into computational agents, they may make more sense than just like talking about them in the abstract. Next, we're going to move on. So we talked about these visual examples. So these were all examples of visual perception mainly, but you can also explore the world of touch and multisensory observations. So our examples with Gibsonian information were limited by vision. In an embodied agent, we can also measure other sensory modalities such as touch. So in this case, the agents are all exploring this map, this representation of the Earth. It's a Dymaxion map, which is a projection of a globe. So now it's exploring the world as this deformation of a sphere, and it's picking up these Breitenberg vehicles are picking up information locally from different parts of the world and then integrating it. And so we can have multimodal combinations in our agents, such as vision and touch. So Breitenberg vehicles traditionally just kind of sense things like simple stimuli like light and other things. And what I'm saying is that Breitenberg vehicles could also be used to integrate a lot of these different modalities, like some sort of visual cue, some sort of touch cue, like a wheel rolling against the ground, or the difference between two wheels, and integrate that as sort of a touch sensation. So in this case, we can see different examples of a Breitenberg vehicle doing these sorts of things. So you can have a Breitenberg vehicle just taking in like a light sense in its front sensors, but it can also do things like take in light and then take in some touch sensation from the wheels, from the effector, and integrate those two things inside. We've been doing things like this in our group, and it's interesting the kinds of internal models that get built by these agents. You also have examples where you have light, you have touch, but you have vision, you have touch, but you also have this integration of this, you have this feedback from this integration to future states. So you have this integration within the internal model that's expressed then as a behavior, which is then integrated into future, doing things in the world that lead it to future evaluations of touch and vision. And so you can play around with the nature of the agent in that way. So next I want to talk about the genotype to phenotype mapping example. And so we have these agents that are sort of genotype to phenotype mappings, but then have this perceptual layer on the top. And so what I mean by genotype to phenotype is by moving from like something like genes and proteins to cells and then to tissues and then to an organism. And so if agents can be embodied sort of in this nondescript body, we talk about embodiment, we can also have these genotype to phenotype mappings, and they help to refine the embodiment aspect of the agent. So in biology, there's this principle of vertical organization, and that's what we're trying to incorporate in these agents. They have these different layers that are basically from, some sort of genotypic representation, and it moves up to some sort of sensory representation that then allows it to interpret the world. And so we've written about this in this paper here. It's on openreview.net. This is an example of a bunch of genotype-phenotype mapping agents looking at this common picture and trying to interpret it from different angles. So it has the same genotypic representation, but it's taking in the angle, the image from different angles, and it's trying to integrate the information. And you can also, the thing is, you can also mutate this genotypic representation to make, to make things more interesting, and then produce collective representations from that. This leads us to something in philosophy that's called intersubjectivity. And so naturally, when you have these populations of agents, one of the things they have to do is build a representation that is common to everyone in the population so that they can all share in the same experience. And so this allows us to build this representational biology of intersubjectivity. I say biology because we're using these genotypic representations, but they build this intersubjective, hopefully they build this intersubjective representation. And so intersubjectivity is much different than, say, like attention or like a memory representation or perceptual representation, in that they allow, they build these agents that are capable of full and equivalent observation. So I can have, when I build my representation as an agent, if I exist in a population of agents, all the other agents are taking in information maybe from different angles or, different, or just from different sampling rates, and they're building all these different representations, but they're not equivalent, so they can't really communicate. In this case, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a way that, or conceive of a way that all of the agents can observe different aspects of the stimulus, but then build a representation that they all can add to later on. So this is a population of agents, each agent knowing a component of X, which is the stimulus, with a mutual Shannon information H. And so these populations of agents can share genotypes, but they still don't necessarily share a representation. They, have this innate ability to share perspectives, gain, knowledge gained from different perspectives or viewpoint perspectives. And their shared knowledge exists as this sort of white box, which we talked about earlier. And so this is, let's see. So this is an example. You have these agents, and they're all looking at this globe, and they're all getting different snapshots of the surface of the globe. So they don't necessarily know it's the same globe. But if they build one of these intersubjective representations, they can actually integrate all of this information in and build this globe. And it relies on the interchange of information, and it relies on something called coordinated perspective taking, which is where they take a perspective of the object, and then they coordinate these perspectives, and they build this representation. This is actually something that people were exploring this in the world of machine learning in terms of multi-view learning. They are using multiple feature sets that they learned from an empirical world, and they're trying to integrate these feature sets. And one of the things that's maybe exciting about this line of work is that it serves as a counterpart to this sort of multi-view learning or multi-feature learning, where you can build representations that integrate all these things that are being observed in the world from different perspectives. So now I'm going to talk about some of these agents where you have not collectives, but you have things where there's sort of different parts of the same agent that are training each other. And what I mean by that is some of the work we've done on observers observing things that are producing patterns, and then the observer reconstructing the patterns. And so this is what is the motivating question here is, what is the relationship between morphogenesis and perception? And so these agents are what we call these morphogenetic agents. So they have a morphogenesis component and a perception component. And they can exist in the same individual, so they can observe other agents, emitters that are emitting patterns, and then they can also be observed by other observers in the population. So they have two components, and there's this link between spatial or restricted shapes and attentional mechanisms in the same agent. What happens is that you have, say, the emitter part is emitting these patterns, and they're emitting shapes, they're emitting sort of striping patterns or whatever, and the observer has to learn what these patterns are. And so they're learning these patterns in conjunction with their emitter part that's trying to produce patterns. And so there's this interaction between perception and morphogenesis, or the generation of patterns, that's kind of fascinating to observe. And so we haven't actually built these yet, but this is an example of something that we're working on. So in this case, we have an emitter that's emitting this pattern, and the observer is trying to learn it. And so they finally get it in this, but they won't take this this short of a time, but this is a quick example where it's trying to guess different patterns and it finally fixes in on the correct pattern. And so you can build adversarial agent-based models this way. You can build a system where you have a random pattern generator that's generating patterns sort of at random, and then you can have an emitter that's generating, say, like stripes, and you can have an observer that's trying to distinguish between those two. And remember, the observer then has an emitter that's also generating patterns. So it's kind of learning how to generate patterns, but also how to interpret patterns at the same time. But in the adversarial case, you're trying to fool it by generating these random patterns. And this is one way to where an agent is really being sort of taking its own capabilities and trying to learn from those, trying to learn from its environment. And we're trying to see what's going on with that. Another example of using observers in modeling are these viewpoint networks. So the viewpoint networks are where we create this isometric projection, which is this series of boxes that look like they're in 3 dimensions, but they're in 2 dimensions. And so they have a lot of interesting angular properties to them. And so then we have all of these agents that are sort of taking different viewpoints of this world. And they're taking different sort of angles on this network of boxes, of cubes, and they're taking in different measurements, and they're getting different information. And the question is, can they integrate this information in a way that we described earlier in terms of intersubjective representation? And so in this case, an agent A takes a vantage point V on this projected geometric object, which is this network, and it forms this network here forms a graph G that then is interpreted by the observer. And so for this population A, each agent takes a particular viewpoint, resulting in a heterogeneous set of perspectives. And so they're all taking their own view. And so this is another example, but using a Mobius strip. And so this is a more complex geometric configuration. This is no longer the isometric network. This is a strip that's a continuous strip, but it has like a lot of, it flips over. So it's this interesting, it results in interesting viewpoints. And so you have these agents, they're all taking their viewpoints on this Mobius strip. Can we approximate a global state sensitive to locally specific features or the context of this Mobius strip? And so what happens is you get these agents that take views across different parts of the Mobius strip. And as you can imagine, if you take a single view, a lot of things are occluded from your view. So this is an example of this agent's view here. And it doesn't really tell you very much about the global state. But what you can do, of course, is have these observations of different agents, and they form this conceptually connected subspace in a phase space. So you have this network of different viewpoints, and then the agents can consult this network and generate an intersubjective representation. Actually, this network in and of itself is an intersubjective representation. It's just that the agents have to act upon it in some way. So this is in their internal model, or at least in the global internal model, which would be shared between agents. Each agent would generate one node of this, and then there would be this connected, it would be connected in some way, so the agents might know that they're in this location, in this position, and they're taking this view, and then they can, of course, share information with their neighbors and say, okay, I'm at this location. What if my neighbor's at the opposite side? This is what they're seeing. And then you can form these networks and get a fuller view of what's going on. And so these are the viewpoint networks idea. Each observer has a unique perspective on the world. Comparison of different perspectives allow for differential forms of learning and super additive information. So future directions on this work. So the viewpoint networks are an interesting way to allow for the merger between physical, perceptual, and cultural relativism. So you have these ideas that are out there in terms of relativistic, the world and how to interpret it in terms of some point of view or some, given certain conditions, your location, whatever. I mean, those things can all be unified, I think, under a number of these different approaches. We can also look at the epistemology of clusters, natural groups, or plenitude, all possible natural types. at the beginning of the talk, I said that a lot of this is, a lot of the idea of what the observer can do is drawn from this idea of an observer choosing from a large collection of alternate possibilities. And so, you can think of this algorithmically as like some sort of algorithmic possibility space where, you're exploring all these different states and you finally settle into an equilibrium state based on your explorations of the world. And so, that might be like some energy minimization, or it might be something more along the lines of like just, some other heuristic that, is maybe more mental or more, based on the internal model than you would otherwise have. Finally, we're working on these things in the group called contextual geometric structures. These things are basically representations of an internal model and an observer, and they represent the cultural world for a particular set of natural features. So in this case, we're looking at the components of a color spectrum, but you can look at all sorts of different concepts and do things like that. And so those are future directions for this sort of observer-based agenda. And so thank you for your attention. We have a group Saturday morning NeuroSim that meets at 3 p.m. UTC on Saturday mornings or Saturday afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And then we record and we put on YouTube. We put the meetings on YouTube, so there's a YouTube collection of the meetings. But we also, when we come to the meetings, we talk about all different topics in neurosimulation. This week we're going to be talking about the NeurOps conference that's going on right now. And we have this project Metabrain Models, which is sort of a project where we're combining different agents and we're seeing what we can, we're layering them in different ways so that we can, maybe build something that more approximates a complex brain. So check that project out as well. It's an open source project. And thank you for your attention.
Yes. All right.
Thank you so much. I wonder if maybe I can quickly inject a question.
Okay.
And
Yeah, there was a bunch of questions that came up in the chat. I didn't really interrupt anything, but there's a lot of things in the chat. I know Charlotte has some, Jeremy had some. If you guys want to ask your own questions, you can. Or if you don't want to talk, I can voice them for you. Go ahead, Charlotte.
yeah, should I? Maybe we can start with the Breitenberg vehicles because Jesse said he wants to go over it a little bit.
Oh, I know. I've done a lot with it, and I know we kind of jumped right into what they were, but I didn't know if people understood. I don't know if people who were familiar with them, but when we're talking about, I said in that chat they're very simple models of, nervous system. The simplest one is like two sensors and two wheels, and how you connect them affects how the agent engages around it. But I didn't know if people were. I kind of mentioned that in case people were, what's a Breitenberg vehicle? Why are we talking about it? If people had any questions about that, I kind of want to give a space to.
I would love. I personally, I would love to know more because I'm doing something on navigation in relation to this whole debate about in animal studies whether a brain region can just compute navigation. So take maybe animals exploration and homing, for example. Whether this path finding is computable from just motion, self-motion, and landmark directions themselves. And I was thinking it would be really interesting to maybe add a modality, because you said you can add touch and then you can deprive vision, we can add vision. So it's exploring an area in real life. And I just thought it would be really cool to see if the navigating abilities of those robots change whether a domain of perception is deprived.
Yeah, we're interested actually in something called developmental Breitenberg vehicles. So this is where we're developing things sort of so we have this embodied, we give it a body and then we start, developing sort of the internal representation based on developing maybe different inputs and outputs to the vehicle. So you start off with maybe like a single sensor and then a single interneuron and then a single effector. And then you might add another sensor on the outside for more vision or more distinct, distinguishing maybe between two wavelengths of light. And then that, goes into like a couple representation with a couple more neurons in it, and then maybe another effector. So we're interested in that sort of pathway from like development where you have no nervous system to development where you have a complex nervous system. And so that, I think that's not the way that Breitenberg envisioned it, but we've been working on this problem. And it's an interesting thing because it's not straightforward in terms of like, it's a very good way to look at like the assembly of a nervous system, but there's no guarantee that, if you like take away vision that you're going to get the same behaviors that you would if you if you take away vision later in development or early in development, you're going to have different nervous systems. But, it'd be very interesting to see what the outcome of that is.
I thought, the vehicle is in itself very promising. You can do lots of things about it. And
it's interesting because like Breitenberg's original book in like the 80s, I think, was like Brain Reveals, or subtitled Experiments in Synthetic Psychology. And what he did, it's really cool. Like he basically took, particularly one of the foundations being like the Binocular Rivalry, where like he took a lot of biological concepts and broke them down. Like, how can I have the simplest toy models possible of this? Like two sensors and how you wire the sensor's effects. Does it go towards us or away from the stimulus? And he was inspired by a lot of specific embodiment structures in biology that affect perception and whatever. And what we've done in the lab is to kind of differentiate from that. We're adding these sort of developmental or learning advanced components to them, like Bradley was saying, which incorporate learning and development. Like what Breitenberg talked about in the book are kind of these static nervous systems, kind of, or static like structures. So we're looking at the development as you go from that to a much more broader structure. And some of the things we were saying at the end, like with contextual geometric structures and creating, how do we get to these spaces that create have the ability to create representations as we're developing. And we didn't talk about it here, but one of the things we're looking at also recently is how different periods of like when like a critical period in development, like when you're what time of how much time, and this actually came up, if anybody is that,
we lost Jesse.
I hope it's not because I'm recording.
I don't think so. Well, yeah, he cut out earlier. Why don't I look at some of the questions here in the chat? So, yeah, we can talk further about Breitenberg vehicles offline if people are interested. There are a lot of things to be said about that. So Jeremy asked, does this...
I actually have a quick question.
Oh, yeah.
About...
Yeah, no, Maria, go.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just a little bit curious. So these Breitenberg models, it seems like they start with vision, right? And then you kind of expand them. So I read a paper a couple years ago by Peter Godfrey Smith called Evolving Across the Explanatory Gap. And he has this really nice idea of afference copies as like the fundamental building blocks of subjectivity. And like the basic idea is just that like nervous systems evolved to control bodies and bodies move. And if the nervous system doesn't have some means of discriminating between changes in the environment that stem from actions of the agent versus changes in the environment that stem from just changes in the environment, then chaos is just going to ensue. And so I think I can see the logic for starting with vision, but I think it's pretty interesting that there was not that much mention of like motion and like efference copies or anything like that. Like you talked about interoception, which is similar, but it's also kind of different. So I was just thinking like that might be an interesting avenue to look at, especially if you're considered in this developmental kind of model of learning.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to add to this. I mean, I'm just kind of giving an overview of some of the things I've explored, but I think that's definitely like there's a lot of communication within the nervous system that is necessary to get like a full, to really kind of draw. Because I talked about the observer observing the world, but then there's also this issue of like sort of the observer affecting the world by being there, by observing it. And we don't really, I mean, and then there are things within the nervous system that are, going to play a role in like whether it's like self-motion or, motion in the environment or, other things that the observer might be stitching together as sort of a fictive view of the world. So I talked about where, you had these event trees where you look at the motion and the consistency of motion. And so if, you're missing frames, where you don't know exactly what happened, you would put them together, you'd make up something. So, that's an example of where you would probably get it wrong if you didn't have, in your internal model, you didn't have mechanisms to sort of, didn't have the right mechanisms to understand what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I visible? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I'm asking something. Anyway, also like one of the people in our Breitenberg group, which we kind of focused on last year more so, that part of it, did like, I don't know if this was said when I was away, so sorry, but they were doing like combining olfactory senses and different senses in their computational model with it. So definitely not just vision, and definitely, I also liked, I forgot who, I think it's Maria who mentioned it, the specific person, but also like, I really like Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's big into, brains evolved to control human bodies, and that's where a lot of the, a lot of the stuff is to regulate that body, and so her take on embodiment and how, what our human intelligence has kind of come to grip terms with, given the affordances of the senses that we have. Like we have a very particular set of, smell, and our eyes are this way, and our legs work a certain way, and all of that intelligence is kind of, constrained by the biology, but at the same time, optimized towards, human intelligence is for human embodiment in that sense. And I think, there's a lot to, as it was kind of talked about yesterday. I think I got cut off when I was mentioning neuro-IPS. I don't know when I was last.
Yeah, I think so.
But Tony Zador's genomic bottleneck talk, there's a really good discussion about many of these things, and what's the line? We're looking at intelligence, and this is a kind of a machine learning conference and stuff. But where is the line between a very generalized intelligence that isn't embodied, and how much do things to be embodied to get to human level or superhuman level? What kind of constraints and sensory inputs or ways of directing attention that are dependent on the agent's, incorporate body, whether it's an actual physical body or whatever the limits of its its membrane are with the external world. Like, how does that affect what it can do, and where can progress be made in looking into those things in different angles? That's a really interesting, and one of the big quests, I think, in like artificial intelligence, and also understanding intelligence broadly. But,
yeah. Let's see. Go to some of the questions in the chat.
I think Jeremy left. I know he asked about constructivist view of perception, and I didn't say anything there, but like obviously, like Gibson. I don't know if people. Gibsonian information is very much direct perception, and what is it called, environmental ecology, psychology, I forget.
Yeah, it's ecological psychology.
Yeah, ecological psychology. So I mean, there are a lot of things interwoven, and
Right.
I don't think this talk was us trying to say this is the right answer, but much more here's kind of a space within which a lot of interesting things are being looked at.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot, of course, to unpack from this, and so, yeah, I think a lot of it, kind of like touched on a little bit, and then so, like for example, with the collectives of agents, and there are a lot of issues sort of embedded in that. So, for example, how do they come to a consensus if they have vastly different views of the world? There's some ways to do that, some ways to get around that with, sort of giving them an innate component or giving them like a common frame or things like that you can build into the agents. But you still run into this issue of how best to, integrate their contributions or their behavior. And much the same holds true within the agents. What's the best architecture to use to get them to like learn something? I mean, learning is actually different than observing. If we're observing things, we're taking in information, and we're maybe putting it into we're maybe viewing it through an internal model. But then when you're actually learning things from the world, maybe de novo, it's a different issue. And so there are whole people working on that problem, and coming at it from a lot of different perspectives. So there's a lot here that's not really like spelled out, but that's because there are just a lot of issues underlying this that so.
Yeah, and this is kind of a follow-up. I know Charlotte in the chat asked, I wonder what would happen if an agent's internal representation and generated action is in conflict with another agent's behavior. And I'm really interested in that question as well. And I think that came up after the representational biology of intersubjectivity part. And I think about that in terms of also like, again, referencing the talk yesterday by Tony Zador, that there was sort of this, what, in terms of like human intelligence, we have billions of years of evolution that are training the sort of basic biology of how to live, okay? And then there's some advancement as evolution takes place and we get to level, and in the last, 10, 50, 100,000 years, there was a dramatic change for Homo sapiens and neocortex and all that stuff. Okay. And then there's also like this culture aspect, and how do we get to be able to form worms of language and develop culture, and so on and so forth. And I feel like, but with that as a backdrop to my upcoming point, I feel like intersubjectivity is a really interesting concept to think about in terms of culture and language and that kind of sharing, and also in terms of, I'm a firm believer of this opinion that humans don't, like, we're all humans, but we have very particular biases, and I don't like the word bias here, but like lopsidedness in our perception of things, and like we can say simple things like personality types, but also just their inclinations to how we perceive information. And one of my friends who's not here, Anson, is really interested in this as well in terms of how there's different differentiation or roles or niches that take place in information processing itself, even at that sort of what might be a culture or social interfacing level. And I feel like, where's the line to kind of go back to the point in the slide, and maybe Charlotte's question a little bit more, and then I'll turn it over to her if she has anything to add to it. But like, how much, because I think in the slide, it said intersubjectivity, and it mentioned like having the full and equivalent ability to perceive something. And I feel like that's a really interesting concept, because having the capacity, and obviously you could go into, what is a full, in a very woke sense, what is a full and equivalent, and does that exist in humans, and neurodivergent types and so on and so forth. But like, what's sort of the threshold for that? Because you have to have I was thinking about this in terms of like watching a movie. Like if you need to be able to watch a movie where you understand, kind of like the scenes with the movie clip we actually
Recording
saw.
has stopped.
Where there were scenes of, you had to. It was much more clear when you saw the one that was a free-flowing stream of information. But if you saw things that are too far apart, it was harder to put together what was going on. And I feel like the same thing with the intersubjectivity is like you kind of have to have a base level, but at the same time, where's the degrees of variance beyond everybody having to have the same potential or outlook? And what does that afford you? Like what can you get at each additional layer of like degree of difference from that versus, what do you lose at the same time? That was kind of meandering, but
okay. Yeah.
I don't know if Charlotte had anything to follow up on that, or I know we also have a minute to go soon. So.
No, I thought it's a question I've been thinking as well, and I think it's a fundamental question. It's philosophers argue a lot about, because I remember this Don Davison quote that you can't agree without a massive background of disagreement, which I thought was really nice. Lots of the things being proposed are based on theory of mind hypotheses, but there's not really. It's really hard to find, or even to say quantify on a neuronal level, what theory of mind actually is, where it's the locus, and how does language affect theory of mind. And I recently saw a paper, I need to find it, but they viewed a conjunctive activation between the theory of the mind system and the language system. And I think it was by Charles Funiholt. I went to his talk on Wednesday. And so they put participants in the scanner, and a group of them viewed only one agent speaking, and the other one of them viewed two agents speaking. And I think they were subsequently asked to generate memories of the scene. And only in the two agent example that they showed this theory of mind activation, the conjunctive area. So I think it's a lingering question, and I don't have maybe to narrow it down a little bit. If you have when you're modeling the swarming example, I was thinking where agents view either a static image or a moving image. If one agent's in the model, if one agent acts not according to the others, would they shift the behavior in maybe like curve towards the other agent's action?
That's the thing. It's like if you get a few stragglers that don't follow the rules there, it doesn't make too much of a difference. But if you get like a critical mass of maybe 10 to 15% of agents that don't do it, then the swarm breaks down. So you'll usually have like these very coherent swarms, but often they'll break apart and form new swarms, and that's because you have heterogeneity within the population. And so they're doing different things, they're not agreeing, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying that like all agents are always going to be in agreement. That's like one of the big issues is like, how do you build sort of this collective intersubjective representation? It's not an easy thing. It's just kind of like, you have to, there are a lot of potential mechanisms to get to that. And, it's not stable over time. Even internal representations aren't necessarily stable over time. So you would have this, you have similar problems. The miracle is that it works, that we actually can do things collectively and that we actually can have percepts. I don't want to say miracle in the religious sense, but it's improbable maybe is more of what I'm thinking here. And so I think that's an important point, is that I show this stuff, and it's not necessarily it's not just the way it works. I mean, there's a lot of mechanism behind it, and a lot of so
Yeah.
A lot of questions.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm done.
I think a really interesting additional approach to that is sort of understanding, like there's so many different layers, and it's like I know like this is like a philosophy crowd, and then my mind's in like all this computational machine learning stuff, and then there's like straight psychology or like broader cognitive science stuff, and I think I really like. I find it most rewarding for me personally to view a lot of this stuff from the sense of embodiment, in the sense of, you know, I think what are the so much in what has existed in terms of intelligence so far in the known universe, which is like biologically speaking so far, you know, so many decisions about what shape intelligence are just really hard fought decisions about how to minimize, you know, energy and computational expenses for an organism's nervous system. And so, you know, in swarm actions, you know, I even thought about the viewpoint. I forgot what it was. The last one, the viewpoint networks, and just like, you know, if you're a bird in a flock, you're not looking at the whole flock. You're looking at kind of this relative motion of this bird next to you, and that's all you really think about. And maybe you do have a sense of who's leading. Like if you're in the flying V, like, okay, it's my turn to go to the front, kind of a thing. Or you kind of, you know, they keep peeling off and go to the back and go to the back. And that's it. There's no one who's like, you know, I'm the leader. And this is also discussed in something like the, I think it's complexity, someone from the complexity science stuff, which is also a whole other great topic for this stuff. But like the centralized mind, I forgot who wrote that, but a lot of times humans will come to stuff and will assume, oh, well, there's got to be a leader in the flying V. There's this leader bird who's directing all of them and saying, hey, it's your turn to go, your turn to come back. In reality, that's not really the case. It's much more there's these flows that are going on, these dynamic, these systems that are sort of not directed by, you know, a monarch of some sort saying where to go, but, you know, and how does that actually more effective and easier computationally, biologically to get to those points of intelligence? It's like, I think that's an important way to look at what's driving these things. And also what I'm kind of in the, I don't know, middle ground or centrist or slightly agnostic camp of like, I don't really adhere to, oh, well, biology is the only way to have intelligence, or biology doesn't matter because we're going to make better deep learning and it's going to make any kind of biological network irrelevant. I don't ascribe to either one of those hard dichotomies, but I think being able to interplay, well, here's what biology has done in the context of, you know, group dynamics versus where can we go and what constraints. I forget if it was Maria or someone else here was like, well, what if they didn't have access to this sensory thing? Like that's something we could kind of maybe computationally explore more and see how that would affect things. And this kind of ties into one thing we're doing in the lab too about developmental freedom in different periods of when is your brain structure set, when is your nervous system structure set, and how does that afford you this set of behaviors, this set of cognitive abilities, this set of, you know, you're a fully matured adult, therefore you have this, what if you're, you know, in the first week or second week of development, this is what your capabilities are, and this is what's in flux and not. So that's all interesting stuff to look at.
Yeah, I think it's really nice. Philosophers like to think about visions. Yeah, and we need to rely on other people to actualize the visions, I think. Yeah, I think, does Maria have anything to add, or is something interesting you want to talk about? Yeah.
I don't really think that I have much of serious substance to add. Yeah.
I think I just checked. I've got the full recording in my Dropbox. I can just easily share the file with you. And and if you want, I would love to check out your weekly meetings. And if you please feel free to just upload to YouTube. And I can send a link to the people who can't attend. I think in general, just computer science scares philosophers because I don't know why. It's I decided to take that switch, but not many people around me are happy to. I guess we'll see what happens in the next 10 years, right? When people realize that it's kind of an integral part of learning to do a bit of both, and then decide, what's good for the future and keep up to date with what everyone's doing. And
there was actually a paper recently published arguing that like computational modeling is just philosophy.
Yeah.
And it was written by philosophers. Let's see if I can find it.
Yeah, like I think like there's a lot of push towards, well, there's different camps, as we probably all know. There's people who who will be kind of purists. I really like the camp where there's like neuroscience is informing computer science and vice versa, and there's interplay about that. I think there's a lot of cool stuff and also like I'm a huge fan of like obviously why I'm here, but philosophy. Like a lot of I spent a lot of last year looking at like Anthony Chimero and his radical embodied cognition work and stuff from there. Because like radical embodied cognition is like you don't have any representations, and what can you do with like this no representation approach to stuff? And I feel like I think academia right now is so bent on people having the one theory that explains everything, and there's that great meme of like scientists in the 1800s of what should I study to learn more about nature versus what should I study and how can I change my studies to get into Nature, the magazine. And it's like there's so much push to kind of be this answer, but at the same time I think so much of what we need to do is really interdisciplinary right now, and continuing to merge all of those questions and having, yes, computer science can be very much applied philosophy, and it can be done in a great way because, there are limitations computationally, but being able to model some things and put some concrete mathematics, which I don't have been a big fan of in some ways, but I am in other ways. The ability to do that, I think, is really important, and the more interdisciplinary stuff we can do, the better. Just the short version of how I feel about that, which is a big part of the lab too, and part of this CAFE series.
Yeah, I learned a lot from today, and I think we can wrap up by maybe clicking on Maria's paper. It's quite nice. I think, one of the biggest advocates of interdisciplinarity between philosophy and cognitive science and other sciences is Carnegie Mellon. And I just click on the author, Kevin Zollman. I think he does game theory and philosophical methods and loss of modeling, things like that. And if Jesse and Bradley, do you have something else to say? Otherwise we can call it a day, and I know you have other meetings to run to.
Yes, back to neuroactives. I think I read a lot, but it's really great to do this. I look forward to going to other cafe meetups, and I'm glad we could do this. So thank you for hosting. And
you did all work. I'll send over the recording just after this, and nice to see you, Maria. And
well, thank you for hosting. Yeah, and I had a good time.
Thank you for joining. I really learned a lot.
Yeah, we had a lot of good turnout here, and other questions came through like Slack and stuff. So it was nice to see. And I'm sure we'll do things again. So just take care, everybody, and I'll see you next time.